Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is Surviving and Thriving in Tumultuous Times and will be moderated by Stephen LaBelle. Stephen LaBelle is a professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. Professor LaBelle has authored, co-authored, and co-edited 7 books on international relations. He is the private investigator for the Department of Defense Minerva Research / Office of Naval Research Awards on power projection, deterrent strategies, and escalation dynamics in an era of challenging near peers, rogue states, and terrorist and insurgent organizations. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Israel and a visiting research fellow at the Nobel Institute. If you have questions during the forum, please enter them into the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Professor LaBelle.
And thank you for the very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce Brett Bruen to the University of Utah, at least virtually. Brett is a graduate with a BA in International Relations from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Go Badgers. Hopefully a number of my students in my foreign policy and international security class are also watching because of their interests. Brett also holds an MA in Global History from London School of Economics. Brett served as a Foreign Service officer for 12 years. As a diplomat, he worked in Ivory Coast, Liberia, Iraq, Venezuela, Argentina, Zambia, and Eritrea, among other places. From 2013 to 2015, Brett served as the Director of Global Engagement on the National Security Council in the White House during the Obama administration. And one of the major events he coordinated was the U.S. response to Russia's propaganda campaign in the Ukraine. Brett teaches crisis communication at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and Brett is the president of the Global Situation Room. The Global Situation Room emphasizes specializations in strategic communications, international market research, and risk management. Brett, welcome to Utah, at least virtually. And we have about 45 minutes, although I have about 3 hours worth of questions. So I'm very much looking forward to talking with you. You're very much on the policy and applied side of most international relations scholars. I want to start with your time as Director of Global Engagement in the White House during the Obama administration. Many of our students at the University of Utah are interested in foreign policy, foreign affairs, diplomacy, foreign service type jobs. Can you tell us about your experience as Director of Global Engagement and also your experiences as a diplomat?
Yeah, and thank you again to the University of Utah and to the community across Salt Lake City and the state for organizing this. Great to have a chance, even virtually, to get out and to connect. My journey in the Foreign Service actually began in the summer of 2001. I was an intern at the UN headquarters in New York. And I remember opening up the New York Times one day and seeing an ad which featured Colin Powell and said, "This man wants to talk to you about a really important job." And so sort of on a whim, I applied for the Foreign Service. And then I went back to Madison to finish out my last year of undergrad. So for those that are undergrads, yes, it is possible to pass the Foreign Service test when you still are. I hadn't even graduated by the time I passed. And then obviously the events of September 11th happened just weeks after I went back to Wisconsin. And it felt like something that I could do to try to put the world back together again. And perhaps it's a sensation that some have given events just of the last several years and how the regularity of risk, the constant crises seem to have just overwhelmed us. And I had no intention when I became a career Foreign Service officer of serving at the White House, of getting into what was a pretty political position. But I went overseas, I sought out the most difficult, the most challenging places I could find. So, you know, when you join the Foreign Service in what's called your A100 class, your orientation class, They give you a list of, in that case, I think it was 99 places around the world that you could go. And I was like, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, civil war, crisis, sign me up. And I was sent over there 3 weeks after I got there. Hostilities between the Ivorian military and, in fact, the French military recommenced. And it was quite a trial by fire. And I just stayed out from there to Venezuela, to Iraq on a forward operating base outside of Tikrit. I was literally on an island unto myself in Madagascar before I went to the White House, thinking nobody's going to pay attention to me out here. And yet, what was interesting is because of the coup there, we lost a lot of our traditional programs, the Fulbright program, a lot of the international visitor programs you may be familiar with. So we had to make stuff up. And we kept on making stuff up, and it was circulating around the corridors in Foggy Bottom, and more people came out to see it. And finally, I got dragged back to Washington and found myself in the Situation Room at the White House and kind of feeling a little bit out of place. And it was interesting because my boss at the time, Ben Rhodes, said, I wanted you because I wanted somebody who was coming in from the field, who understood what it was like to try and implement some of these programs. And I'm sure we'll get into it, Professor, but it was fascinating because in just my first few months, we faced 2 civil wars in Africa, Central African Republic and South Sudan. Then Russia invades Crimea, ISIS comes on the scene, and it was astonishing that we had not actually gone to the trouble of saying, okay, civil wars in Africa, Russia meddling on its borders, extremist groups in the Middle East. What tools, what infrastructure would we need to have in place ahead of time? And so we really were trying every time that there was a new flood to rebuild an arc.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit more. Tell us about some of the skills you've learned as a diplomat and as director of global engagement.
So I like to call myself a recovering diplomat. And Winston Churchill famously said, and some of you may know, that diplomats can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you look forward to the journey. And I actually found it to be a real challenge 6 years ago, transitioning into the private sector, because we do speak in this kind of circumlocucious way. And there's a point to it. We don't want to offend the host government. We don't want to offend other interlocutors. And so we try to find a way of talking around things. And as that was a challenge, can be useful. It certainly can be useful in communications to find indirect ways of describing things. But the most important thing that I learned as a diplomat, and I would share this especially for those who are looking at setting out upon their careers in the coming months, coming years, is the value of personal relationships. And you hear it a lot, but I want to emphasize something. Being connected on LinkedIn or on Twitter or whatever your social media platform of choice is not an actual relationship. We spend hours, we spend days, months trying to cultivate relationships as diplomats, getting people to trust you. I mean, I came in under George W. Bush after Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and there was a lot of distrust and dislike of American policy. But if you could get them to like you, then they would listen to you. And I remember there was a shock jock. It was actually a female shock jock on the radio in Madagascar. And she was, virulently anti-American. And I made it my mission to try and befriend her. And we actually became very close friends. She stood me up for lunch a few times. And finally, we hit it off. And that relationship was critical for us, both in terms of understanding the regime at the time, and then she split with the regime and was somebody who was out as, in fact, a strong voice for a free press and for democracy and human rights. And now in my private sector life, what I am fascinated by is how little time goes in, whether it's from public relations agencies, whether it's from consulting groups or those even in government, to saying, okay, rather than looking at a relationship in a transactional way, how do I identify interesting people, influential people potentially, and over time cultivate that? I call it a continuum of contact. You go from the beginning, where you're exposing someone to who you are, to what you do, and you steadily walk them through the education, the engagement, and then ultimately expanding the relationship both with them and then ideally, obviously, through their network. And if you can master that, if you can master the art of those personal relationships and the both cultivation and then the continuity of relationships, you're going to be bound for success.
This is excellent. In fact, there's a number of programs. One of them, I think, of Bridging the Gap, that tries to bridge the gap between kind of academic work and policymakers and practitioners like yourself. And you can kind of see the blending of the two in your comments. You mentioned Ukraine. You mentioned ISIS. Tell us what else. What other kind of crises did you respond to as Director of Global Engagement?
You know, the one I'm proudest of was actually our response to the kidnapping of the schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria. And some of you may have followed those events. It was certainly an issue that had captivated the attention of the president, the first lady. In fact, Michelle Obama came out with a hashtag Bring Back Their Girls photo. And I remember sitting in the Situation Room, we were listening to intelligence reports and conversations about how we were going to send in, troops to try to find them, and asked myself, if this hashtag, Bring Back Our Girls, is successful, what does that look like? And ultimately, do we think it's going to reach 1 billion, retweets or views, and Boko Haram's going to throw up their hands and say, oh my gosh, we've got to let the girls go? No, in fact, what it was doing and what my analysis at the time suggested is it's actually amplifying the danger of sending girls to school. And I think this is a common mistake that companies, governments, other organizations make in crisis. You fall into whatever the frame that the adversary, that the attack has set for you, rather than coming up with a more constructive context for the conversation. And so in the case of Nigeria and the schoolgirls, we actually were already, because of the process that I'd started on counter-crisis communications and looking at our response, particularly into South Sudan, in communications with the former editor at Variety magazine out in Hollywood. And I said, Brian, what could we do here? And we ideated a bit, and ultimately we came up with Let Girls Learn. And he said, I can get, Anne Hathaway and Alicia Keys and Susan Sarandon and a whole host of other celebrities together. And we said, right, okay, but what do we want them to do? Because there are too many of these kind of celebrity-led campaigns. And so within the government, worked with USAID and a few other agencies and got all of the major players in girls' education together and said, okay, can you give us one simple thing that if I am a schoolgirl in Indiana or in Utah, and I want to help girls in Nigeria or in Bangladesh or somewhere else go to school, what could I do? And so they came up with things like, funding a school uniform or school lunches or, even volunteer opportunities. And it became such a successful campaign because what we did is say to Boko Haram, you're going to engage in these kind of attacks or these kind of kidnappings. We're going to drive more attention, more resources to girls getting to school. There were 62 million girls at the time that were not in school. There were tens of millions trying to stay in school. And it's that counter narrative that's so critical in communications because, going back to ISIS is out trying to advance a narrative. Putin is trying to advance a narrative. He's saying the sky is purple. We're saying it's not. We're still talking about, the purple sky, rather than coming up with the conversation that will take it off of the terms that they have set and put it into the terms that we want to talk about.
Thank you. Excellent. And again, you highlighted your personal relationships and how those are important as a diplomat. I want to flip over to a couple of kind of nuts and bolts questions that I'm really interested in hearing your response. I mean, your public and private career is focused on international crises, and you talked about this already. Can you tell us what is a crisis? And I'm also interested, you mentioned counter-crisis communications theory. I want to know, what is this? What's new about this? But first, I want to know, what is a crisis?
Really good question. And one of the benefits of sitting at the White House on the National Security Council is you get to convene a lot of smart people. And so over the course of this counter-crisis communications exercise, I got to hear from lots of experts in the intelligence community, Defense Department, State Department, other parts of our federal government. What I realized in listening to all their presentations is that we're looking at crises too late. And I ended up breaking it down into 3 categories. So you have the intense crisis. That's when most of us look at it as, yes, that's a crisis. There's a stage before that. And I've done this with clients when we, like with a CEO, and we're in the middle of a crisis, and I said, this is exactly where you are, in that increasing stage. And then below that, you have the initial stage. That's when the gears are starting to creak a little bit and where you're having problems percolate up. And there's good definitions that go along with each of those. But my point to everyone, and if you take nothing away from our time together today, I would offer we have to move faster and more fully in response to the exploitation of vulnerabilities, to those initial issues. This idea of let's wait and see. Wait and you will see. And that's the problem we have seen so many times in the case of government or in the case of the private sector, where they are simply too slow. They act on too small of a scale and with too little sophistication. And that today, you can have somebody who takes a photo in their phone, shoots it out into social media. And the problem is that, in most cases, the reaction then is, okay, well, let's have a meeting or a conference call or a Zoom, talk about that. And so the other part of this moving up is this notion of you've got to have those tools built ahead of time. And with each of those stages, I was interested in, well, what could we do or what should we do differently? That first stage, that initial stage, you can introduce an alternative. You can literally reframe the conversation in most cases. In that second stage where things are increasing, you have to finesse the frame. You can't reframe the entire issue, but you can find the weakest point in that argument and push out on that. And even that last piece, in the intense stage of a crisis, one, I would quote from Hollywood, no crisis is bad news. It's always an opportunity to educate people about who you are and what you do. And I use the Mandarin for crisis, which is actually made up of 2 symbols. And if there are any Mandarin speakers on here, you'll probably know this better than I. One is the symbol for danger, but the other is the symbol for opportunity. And my message is, in this moment of constant crises, we have to be ready, not just to hide under the table or batten down the hatches, but to get out into the storm and to engage and to seize opportunities, because that's where the disruptive change that we've seen take place so often is to be found. But you've got to prepare yourself, you've got to prepare your team, you've got to have all of those tools that let you get out into the tumultuous waters and to be effective.
Kind of following up on this, on these 3 stages, are there risk indicators? Are there ways to identify vulnerabilities? I know you talk about some crisis countermeasures. How do we know? How can we how do we know where we are?
Yeah, so there's the first exercise you have to do, which is taking a look in the mirror, and whether it's for yourself or your organization, because don't forget, we all also have, I did a session a couple weeks ago, I think, with Princess Di's former chief of staff. And we were talking about personal branding. And all of us now these days have to manage our personal or professional brands. So look at yourself in the mirror, look at your organization and your team and say, okay, what honestly could go wrong? What is that thing that's sitting in the back of your mind? It's like, oh my gosh, if that got out, I would really be facing some serious scrutiny. And then don't just stuff it away back into your mind or your worries, but how do I engage? What could I use? And it's going through that process, and I literally map it out into 4 quadrants. What's the most likely and the most damaging thing that could happen? Then what is likely but potentially less damaging, and then less likely but still quite damaging, and finally less likely and less damaging. if you do all of that, and you map out everything, don't say, oh, well, we're only focused on these issues. There was a commander in Iraq I served alongside of, who's now actually a general in the Army Chief of Staff, General Walt Pyatt, and he said, you be so focused on the problem that you miss the threat. And I think we get into a bit of this groupthink, or we drink too much of the Kool-Aid or sparkling water and say, yes, we're all worried about China, we're all worried about ISIS. And quite frankly, when I was at the NSC, nobody was thinking about ISIS or that risk, because we were all focused on the pivot to the Pacific and the other risks around the world. So having that visibility and going through that exercise with your team is so important. And then you go through to the question about risk indicators. Okay, well, what could I use to measure these things? And not just, am I being mentioned in the media or on social media, but how do you determine ahead of time? And one of the easiest ways that I can offer to do this is, obviously, every organization will have their critics. So who are those critics? What are they focused on? What's the frequency with which they're focused on those issues? What's the ferocity with which they're focused on those issues? Because often, if you're going to level an attack against an organization, you have to create the predicate. So if you're out kind of monitoring, saying, hey, the anti-skiing resort associations really focused on environmental issues at the moment. So we can perhaps be somewhat certain that they are engaging or preparing something. Those things can help. And I think also, when it comes to an organization itself, you too often don't take into account what's happening to organizations that are similar to yours. We're just going through this exercise now with a client doing a crisis audit and saying, okay, you're worried about these. Have you taken a look over here as to what are happening to similar organizations in your space or in tangentially related spaces? Because that might inform, we could see that, or this other issue happen. And then lastly, I'm a student of history. You mentioned I went to London School of Economics. I got my master's in world economic history, which is, as those master's degrees go, not as practical as most. But what it informed was an understanding that I can actually build trajectories. I can quantify trends in the past. And so if you want a good indicator, look at the past and start to try to quantify what's happened, because it'll give you a sense of where we're going.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, recurring patterns. We talk about this a lot in class. Let me ask you, you wrote that the Obama White House began to experiment with a more proactive form of crisis communications. Can you give us some examples, again, from either your diplomatic experience or director of global engagement, of kind of a successful application of counter-crisis communications?
Yeah, let me take you to Ukraine again. And when the Russians had unleashed not only the little green men into Crimea and later Luhansk and Donetsk, and there's a good CNN investigation, if folks are interested, that profiled a little bit of what we did. But that was the moment where I went to Ben and I said, you know what, I've been working on this kind of theoretical counter-crisis exercise after the civil wars in Africa. I think we've got an opportunity and a need to take this thing out for a spin. And so what we did was, in fairly record time for government, put together an interagency information task force. So you had folks from the military, folks from the State Department, telecommunity, and they all worked alongside one another. And one of the most effective things, and some of it we can't talk about, unfortunately, still, but one of the most effective things that they did was to get everyone on the same page, whether it was in our government. We worked a lot with our European governments and said, right, okay, what is the message both that we're seeing, as well as what are we seeing from the Russians and from some of their allies? Because when you look at disinformation, there isn't much tracking going on. I mean, think about just with the election meddling. Where do you go to see, here are the latest lines of attack from Russian propagandists, from the Internet Research Agency? And that familiarity, that awareness is just not there. And then secondly, what defensive capabilities can we build? And, I would argue, for instance, in our own elections, I have argued that we need a heck of a lot more defensive resources. So if I'm a congressional candidate and running, in the 2022 elections primaries in Utah, and I start to notice a whole bunch of disinformation spread about me, about my candidacy, where do I go? You can't pick up the FBI, on the phone and say, excuse me, agent so-and-so, can you come out here and help me with this? They'll they'll be out there, if somebody's on the street, but we have to actually create those resources, create that capability. And I fear we spend way too much time and way too many resources on, oh, let's protect our election system. So, the voting machines and fine. But if I'm Russia and I'm putting myself in the mind of a propagandist, I don't actually need to break into New York State's, voting systems. I can go out to somewhere in Podunk, wherever, break into the voting machine, amplify the heck out of it. And now all of a sudden I've achieved my objective because I, have shown that there is that vulnerability, and now everybody believes the whole system is potentially compromised. So one of the things that we did, and this is public knowledge, when Russia was moving armaments across into Ukraine, we were seeing it with our satellites, and yet unlike Donald Trump, we weren't going to release those classified images, but we tasked commercial satellites to go and take photos, and then we released those. And it was a shot across the bow and said, hey, you continue to do this. We are watching, we are prepared to weaponize information in a positive way. I think, you see a lot of information weaponization from Russia, China, Iran, and others. But, and this is my most controversial, I'll acknowledge, belief is we actually, in order to create a significant enough deterrence against Russian, Chinese, Iranian disinformation, have to pick up the phone, in this case now, Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, Tony Blinken, and say, right, Vladimir, knock it off, or I'm going to give you some of your own medicine. You ain't going to like it. And these guys, if you think about, what are their weaknesses? They're basically, being propped up by propaganda. So, for instance, what's going on now in Russia with Alexei Navalny? Well, we could shine a bright light of transparency on the corruption and the mismanagement across Russia, and that would have a pretty significant effect, and it would scare, Putin enough, I believe, and based on, my experience working on it, to back off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And let me run with that a little bit more. You mentioned kind of defensive, and I assume what you're talking about are your defensive countermeasures. In our work, we use the DIME acronym, the diplomacy, information, military, and economic, and both power projection and deterrence. Can you give us a sense more about kind of these crisis countermeasures?
Yeah, so the idea with a countermeasure is the following. You have put in place your counter-crisis infrastructure, which, they could be partnerships, they could be a whole range of information materials, websites, fact sheets, other things. That is one component of it. And then we also talk about your reservoirs of strategic goodwill. If you think about it, all of us are or are not forgivable, to use a phrase that Patrick Jepson, who had worked with Princess Di, really enjoys talking about, because he said, look, Princess Di was not a perfect person. I mean, getting a divorce from the monarchy in the 1990s was a rather radical thing to do, but she was forgivable. And the interesting thing is companies or even governments can be forgivable. Apple, very forgivable. They told the FBI in the midst of a terrorism investigation to go take a hike. Microsoft, not so forgivable. And so how do you create that reservoir of goodwill ahead of time so that when something goes wrong, like for instance, let's just take an instance of a factory producing widgets, and one widget comes out with a defect. Now all of a sudden, on the evening news in Salt Lake City, it's, oh my gosh, John's widget factory is making terrible widgets. No, it was one out of the millions that we make. So your counter-crisis infrastructure helps you to pull that conversation out, to zoom it out, and to say, look, we're glad you asked about our widget making process. We make 10,000 widgets a day, and they're all quality checked and controlled. Now, into that situation, you introduce a countermeasure. And a countermeasure essentially is a new program, a new policy, a new process, something that you've gone to the trouble of building up ahead of time. You said, okay, if we have an issue of negligence or a defect in the process, what would we need to deploy into that situation to allow us not just to be in the reactive posture of, oh my gosh, no, we don't make bad widgets, but instead to fast forward? Because one of the strategies that we advise clients of is, yes, when you're in that intense stage of crisis, you need to fill the frame. You need to get out there. And there are great examples, particularly for those familiar with government, whether it was Hillary Clinton during the Benghazi hearing. She sat there for 12 hours. She answered every question. And then it's about, all right, let me fast forward to the next chapter. The countermeasure helps you do that. The countermeasure helps you say, I understand that there may be some questions, there may be some concerns around our widget making process. So we are instituting an external partnership with the University of Utah, who's going to help us to, oversee and ensure and provide, best practices. That's your countermeasure.
Excellent. Yeah. And I want to circle back to some of this after a question or two, especially in terms of great power competition and relations and the importance of those relationships. I want to ask you a question of kind of that goes back to some of the work we're doing. We have a DoD Minerva Research Initiative Award, and we're studying something called near crisis, which is very similar to your initial stage. And we found that this is really understudied. And there's just not very much work. We're interested in why near crises tip into crises. They become full-blown crises, things we read in the New York Times. Most of the things that happen in the world, as you talk about, never make it in the newspaper. They never escalate to crises. And so I'm wondering a little bit, what kind of factors do you think influence why crises develop and escalate and others never tip and never make it in the newspaper, get buried in the back pages of the paper? What kind of factors influence why some things become full-blown crises and others just de-escalate?
Well, I'll point to one. There are a lot, but let's just, for the purposes of this discussion, focus on one that we spend a lot of time looking at, which is, do you have a organized group of people? Because if you have that group of activists or that aggrieved party, then that is more likely to become an increasing or even an intense crisis. Whereas if it's an isolated group, or if they have not really congealed into an entity of some sort that can exert influence and can draw attention to the issue. Other factors include, and we've seen this play out with a number of crises, is there a photo, is there a video, is there some image that could go viral? That obviously, and we've seen the tragedies, for instance, of the George Floyd incident and many others, which, because there is the video, it just brings it more vividly into relief. There's another element which is only tangentially related to this, but I will stuff it in here because I think it's an important point for people to understand about crisis. Crises are experienced emotionally, yet most crisis response is a very logical, rational, well orchestrated argument. And that's the disconnect. So you have the emotion up here, and down here is what the government or what the company is telling you. So we work on, how do you help as a spokesperson, how do you work as an organization to be more emotional, to be more authentic, so that you're not just coming out and saying, I, Brett Bruen, speaking on behalf of the Department of Agriculture, do apologize in sincere terms. That's not authentic. Whereas if you can bring out the personalization of it, and there's some great examples. I'd encourage people to look at what Tony Mendez, the CEO of AirAsia, did after they had a plane go down. It was he wasn't putting out, the company wasn't putting out these very carefully worded tweets. He was speaking seemingly authentically and personally. And it's interesting because then you contrast that, for instance, with what happened to Oscar Munoz, the head of United Airlines, after Dr. Dow was so violently pulled off, or as they would say, reaccommodated. Now, I remember telling a bunch of lawyers this at a conference. I was like, I'm sure that terminology, reaccommodated, was approved or even developed by some lawyer who said, yep, we can legally, and soundly say he was reaccommodated. It may be legally smart, but it is communication stupid. And so thinking about, and this is the notion of the counter crisis process of saying, all right, let's come together and look at those vulnerabilities ahead of time and say, right, if we had a crew member or a passenger or some incident on a plane, and you've got 200 people all with their phone at the ready, what would we need as a countermeasure to deploy in that? And then, as I was saying before, what's the infrastructure and those strategic reservoirs of goodwill? Because it could look very different. And so that you're not necessarily going into that situation without the right support, without the right validators and amplifiers and measures at the ready to say, we understand this is an issue, but let me zoom it out and talk a little bit about how we book passengers and also perhaps we're trying to get people to where they want to go. There's a lot of in that case a lot of oversold flights, and we're doing our best, and here are some of the mitigation measures that we take.
Let me ask just one last question. Again, this is just out of what we're doing in our Minerva research project. I just want to, what we find in our project and what the DoD wants is ability to have these predictive models. And what we found is that there's just a lack of data on these periods prior to the onset of crisis, kind of that initial stage that you talk about. And you wrote somewhere else that the outcome of crisis largely depends on the government's actions before it's called a crisis. There's a period just prior to a crisis when leaders can have the most impact on the trajectory of events take. And it strikes me that initial stage is essential, whether these things tip into full-blown crises or whether they get buried somewhere back in the New York Times or don't even make it into the paper. Tell us a little bit more what you mean by your statement.
So what I would say is, back to this idea of how do I move up an organization's crisis response? So let me put this into practical terms. Often the crisis management plan is developed by the folks at the top level. And then they try to press it down. It's like, okay, let's inform or simulate what a crisis looks like. My contention is that's absolutely the wrong way to come up with a crisis plan. Instead, you go out to your frontline workers, your factory workers, the folks who are sitting in the lobby, not just to train them, but engage them on the process. What are you seeing? What has gone wrong? What could go wrong? And then ask, what could you do about it? And I've done a couple of these talks to the International Contract Managers Association. And I said, your contract could be this incredibly powerful vehicle for strengthening what currently is the weakest link in your organization. Because if I am a factory worker, if I'm a contractor, I'm loath to raise my hand and say, oh, I think we've got a problem over here. Whereas if you bake into that contractor or you work with your whole team and say, all right, let's talk about the potential vulnerabilities, let's talk about how we track them so that then when you see that as the factory worker, you're like, hey, I think we've got an issue over here with the widgets, then they're going to bring that to the attention. Then they're going to feel like, oh, not only am I empowered to say something, but I also am generally familiar with what we would do. And so now all of a sudden it very much becomes, and I think perhaps a thought for the university crowd here is I don't think that anyone should be graduating from university, and certainly not with certain degrees like an MBA, without having achieved proficiency in crisis management. I mean, today, it just is insane that you're sending somebody out into the world, into a world that is so uncertain and full of such upheaval. And we don't have the capacity. We don't train people in what that requires. And it's not, again, just the top level. It's bringing it down as an entry-level employee. I want you to be my strongest defense against potential crisis.
Yeah, excellent. Let me flip this over now too. We have still a little bit of time left, kind of practical policy issues, given your years of service in both the private and public sector, what are the most damaging vulnerabilities facing the US today?
Well, I've been talking about, and you can, if you're interested, read some of the thoughts that I've got on this post-American era. And I don't say this with any sense of satisfaction, but I do feel as though America has abdicated its role and also its responsibilities and indeed its influence in the world. And there's no going back. And I'm sorry to be the cynical voice on this, but if you look at, for instance, where we were in 2000, and then when Barack Obama came into office after George W. Bush's presidency, we did not go back to where we were, despite the Obama bounce in global opinion. We are not going back to where we were under Obama now with Biden, and I think we have to come to terms with the fact that yes, the U.S. will still be a powerful country, but we will have that power diluted. And what you're seeing is, a global power struggle between China, between the likes of, middling countries, even Saudi Arabia, Turkey, obviously Iran, and certainly Russia. But that's going to create more friction. We're going to see more wars. We're going to see more conflict in the world. And I have a piece coming out this week for Business Insider, which is along the same line of asking the question, what if Joe Biden fails? And I'm not saying this again because I wish him to fail, but I'm asking the question because I think there is this hope and this aspiration now that Biden's going to be able to restore and to rebuild much of what was lost. And I still hope and feel that he can get some of that done, but let's assume he can't even get that done. Let's assume, just for argument's sake, that we have lost most of our international influence, that we have lost, more than we can repair. What does a world in which, Joe Biden fails look like? And what do we need to be preparing now? And the end of that article concludes with the notion that, for most of the last century, we were on offense. We were setting the rules and enforcing them. We got to get better at defense.
Yeah, yep. We've talked about this in my classes. This ongoing debate between kind of the lean forward versus pull back. As you use kind of history and theory to look into your crystal ball, where do you see the threats facing the U.S. becoming full-blown crises? What should we focus on? You've talked about the role of infrastructure and this initial stages. What should we be looking at?
Well, I certainly continue to look at disinformation, and some will call it like we're now in a post-truth era. And we've seen the effects of that on our politics. I fear we're going to continue to witness efforts in both business and economic spheres, as well as in social issues, not just by the likes of Russia, China, but the Free Wherever-Stan Army is going to see the potential both to sow doubt, division, and distrust, but as well, they're going to take a page from whether it's ISIS's playbook or, for that matter, Donald Trump's playbook, and say, I can build myself up as a movement, as ISIS did, and fill their ranks and their coffers, and really almost entirely through propaganda become this internationally influential entity. And I worry that we will continue to see the spread of that disinformation, and it will get more sophisticated. One of the things that I've been mentioning of late is, cyber attacks, yes, they're damaging. But you know what's really damaging? Somebody hacks into your system, spills out a bunch of information, as they did in the Macron presidential campaign in France, and then inserts some fabricated images or emails into there. How do you disprove that? And now all of a sudden we're going to be in this world of battling against these phantom facts. And that is a really, really scary place to be. So that's certainly top of mind in terms of the risks that I think we will face. I also, and I've done some talks over in Shanghai and Beijing, and I worry that China is feeling not just emboldened, but in some ways unleashed And we saw it play out with the Hong Kong protests and with Uyghurs in the West. I lived through it. We worked as doing communications for a candidate from the country of Georgia running to lead the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And China just essentially bought off or threatened 107 countries and managed to take the head of that UN agency. We've seen obviously what they've been able to do with the World Health Organization just in the last couple of days. I think China is going to look at the world and say, this is our moment. And what is worrying to me is that the Chinese think in terms of decades or even centuries. And we continue to, and you may have seen, I've been critical of some of my former colleagues who are now in the in the Biden administration, because we have too many political folks at the top, in my view. We, if we're going to be competitive against Russia or China, I think need to go back to a place where the national security infrastructure is more dependent on experienced career diplomats and officials, rather than these, political actors that come in for a couple of years at a time and try to score some, quick points.
Yeah, no, I hear you on this. So given COVID, given great power competition, given a resurgent Russia, collapsing international order, domestic terrorism, climate change, cyber, what's missing in the U.S. current strategy? What infrastructure do we need to be ready to respond effectively to nip these initial stages, get them before they increase, and definitely be prepared for the intense stage of crisis?
Well, I do continue to worry about the effect of a group of radicals, whether, in our country, certainly we've seen the work of domestic terrorism in the last few months. And let's not forget that ISIS, and that whether it's Islamic extremism or any other form of extremism, is not behind us. And that the embers of some of those movements and that discontent remains. And so while certainly everything that you just rattled off are major global crises, I continue to worry about that free wherever a stand army that's out, and that amidst this friction of a post-American era is able to exploit or is able to gain support from one country or another. I mean, we saw what happened, for instance, in between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And they were, largely being supported in Azerbaijan's case by the Turks. And so this isn't just, the large superpowers that are driving this. This can, again, in a post-American era, be, smaller countries that are looking to take a larger role. And I think it'll be interesting also to see where the Biden administration comes down on some of these issues. And I certainly hope that they will be more aggressive than we were in the Obama administration. And it's encouraging. And one of the predictions I had was that, Biden is going to try to pocket a lot of the gains from the Trump administration, whether it was on China, even, the Iran deal, or we just saw, for instance, in the case of Israel, saying we're not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. So Biden's going to tell Tehran, yeah, I want back into the Iran deal, but you're going to have to make some compromises on the missiles, on your extracurricular activities in Yemen and Lebanon, and then we can, talk. But the question that looms large right now is how, one, aggressively they will do it, and then how successful they will be in pushing that issue. I think it's going to also come down, interestingly, to how much we're able to bring the Europeans along with us. And one of the factors to watch is, and in talking to leaders in Europe, I don't think they're going to go back to where we were before in our relationship. And I worry, actually, with some of the folks that have been brought in by Biden, that they're used to operating in a world where America's place was quite different, and America's word was quite different than it is now. And the Europeans, in Brussels in particular, are going to say, we're not going to be the little brother again, kind of trailing behind you, trying to find out, what you're going to do, and having a level of impact that is pretty minuscule. We expect to be a much larger player in this space, and it'll be interesting how that all works out.
Excellent. Let me, I'm going to slowly pull in some questions. I have a list more, but I'll pull in some questions. Um, uh, Kind of along this, somebody asks about countries have approached the crisis of COVID-19 differently. What countries' responses do you think were the most beneficial and the most detrimental? Again, I'm kind of curious, given your experience as a diplomat and director of global engagement, we always want some insight of what's going on inside, that small inner group, what we call in my work, the foreign policy executive. You've seen how they operate. Give us a feel of how they're addressing the COVID crisis, and which countries do you think have been most beneficial and detrimental? What does that look like if we get a look inside, crack open that small group of decision makers and see what this process actually looks like?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I mean, this crew is largely the same as I worked alongside of in the Obama administration, and they are very experienced and steeped in a lot of both these issues, and in some cases in the actual work, for instance, on Iran. They're going to bring in Rob Malley, and he worked the Iran deal last time. So he'll certainly be able to pick up from a point that's more advanced than somebody starting from scratch. Tony Blinken, he came last year or year before to my class at Georgetown. Somebody's incredibly just nice, genuine guy. And I think he does mean to try and set a different tone at the State Department. What I worry about, as I mentioned earlier, is that there aren't enough career diplomats that are in that inner circle, that this crew is a little bit insular. And I think, because they have all, largely stayed together in the 4 years since we were in government together, that they aren't going to take enough external input into some of those decisions. They also tended, and part of this came from President Obama, who was both cautious. He was, and I say this lovingly, professorial, and would want to study decisions. I mean, we must have had dozens of meetings on whether or not we would send lethal defensive weapons to the Ukrainians, the javelins, some of the other anti-tank weapons. And, I hope that this time we will be more decisive. I hope that they will not get mired down in process, and that there will be an effort. And one of the things I actually was encouraged by is I heard just before the inauguration that Biden had started tearing up some of the statements that were coming to him from staff and saying, if Joe or Sally in Youngstown, Ohio can't understand what the heck we're saying, then we shouldn't be saying it. And I do worry that a lot of these folks who are part of the foreign policy blob are not going to be effective at communicating what we're doing in a way that convinces skeptical Americans of its value.
Good. Yep. That makes sense. Another question. This is a good question also. What are recommendations for situations which have multiple crises at once? And we know that you never have the luxury of dealing with these. You never get the crisis you want to deal with. With your emphasis on acting quickly, especially in that initial stage, I wonder what you would recommend if resources would not permit response to all crises. How do you prioritize?
Let me start off with a point and then delve into the meat of the question. I worry that we are so focused right now, whether it's on COVID or on political polarization, racial injustice, that we haven't appreciated how weak, kind of from an institutional standpoint, we are becoming, and that once we emerge from this, because of the vaccine, because of other steps, that it's going to be the small thing that's going to get us as an organization. And look, we've all been working in silos. We're going to come back together, and it's going to be a very different world. So how do you deal with it? One of the key things that I would advocate for is you want to be able, even if you haven't gone to the trouble of creating the counter crisis infrastructure, the countermeasures ahead of time, you want to be able to not focus on, okay, I've got this 3-ring circus of crises that I'm dealing with. Don't lose sight of where are we trying to go. And that, I think, can really help to inform the response, because there is this tendency to firefight and to just try to douse the flames. And there also, and we see this constantly in government, is like, yes, if you're constantly firefighting, you're going to go from one fire to the next, versus saying, how do I and who is going to help us step back from this crisis, and to figure out not just how do we deal with this issue. And I want to also try to disabuse people of this notion of crisis management as resetting to where you were before. There is no reset, especially these days. So if you think about it, crisis management, or as I describe it, counter-crisis management, is finding your next chapter. And so thinking about it not as, oh my gosh, I've got these 3 crises that I got to manage at once. Well, what's the next chapter that you want? And start working towards that. Oh, sorry, I think you may be on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah. At least it wasn't a cat filter, then we'd really be in trouble.
Yeah, I know. It's, I have kind of 2 related questions. They're about interpersonal skills are important without a doubt. What skills have you learned that are important? And also a similar skill, a background. What's your background experience in education helped you cultivate the way you approach a crisis? I'm going to pitch this a little bit more, given your global situation room and your emphasis on risk management. I know Ian Bremmer, his Eurasia group, puts together this 10 threats that we're going to face. Kind of based on your experience, I'm going to ask you to look in that crystal ball. What do you see with this new Biden administration? What are the 10 or so threats that, as a risk management person, what do you see coming?
Let me first get the question about like personal relationships. What I think we miss the opportunity to do in most cases, and especially now that we're all living virtually, is take the time to not only ask somebody, but even volunteer for yourself of like, hey, I was out playing with my son this weekend. We had a great soccer game, because it now puts the conversation into different territory. It allows you to tell this person, hey, I want to have a deeper conversation. Take the time also, not just to wish them happy birthday or congratulate them on a promotion or a new job, but it is that constant contact of saying, I found something that might be interesting for you. But you have to be deliberate about it. You have to really be conscious and looking out and trying to create those opportunities. On the question of what are the 10 issues, I worry also, I feel like covering all of my worries in the world. I worry about Africa. I think we have ignored Africa for too long. It's good. Linda Thomas Greenfield is our nominee to be ambassador to the UN, somebody who I worked with alongside her in the Africa Bureau. But major problems with security, major problems with health, and we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, if we don't address it in Africa, if we don't address it in South Asia, if we don't address it in some of those other parts of the world, it will continue to mutate. And we'll have not only the South Africa variant, we'll have the Zambian variant, we'll have the Burkina Fasoian variant. It's going to be a little bit of a hot mess. I do think that we are going to continue to contend with North Korea, and Kim Jong-un is not going to take kindly to the loss of his summits and his stage, and the love and affection that he received from the White House. And what does he do in those circumstances? He saber rattles, he shoots off missiles, and that could be certainly problematic. I think there's also a lot of worry in Latin America. I don't know, perhaps we've got some folks on the program who look at that region of the world, but we are seeing, I spent time, as was mentioned, in Venezuela. I think that is just going to continue to descend into both a political, security, health abyss. And we also, I think, are seeing with the economic challenges we're facing, return to the kind of Lopez Obrador in Mexico, populism, almost Trumpian, but from the other end of the political spectrum. Certainly, Argentina's gone back down that path. Again, Bolivia recently, and I worry about that. And we have overlooked too often, our own hemisphere. And then I would say, I think we have to be on the lookout for how damaged these international institutions are after Trump, whether it's NATO, the World Health Organization. I've done some informal advising to WHO on communications, and I feel like it's, again, going to be hard for them to reassert, whether it's in NATO's case, the sense of deterrence, the sense of common purpose. And they're going to have to work very deliberately. And in some cases, we may need simply a new federation, a new institution that's able to better address the problems we've got.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we're about to the point we're going to wrap up. One final question, and we started with this also. Kind of what advice would you give you students who are interested in pursuing careers in foreign affairs, foreign service, students who say, they want to be where you are, and in 20 or so years?
Well, I would first encourage you certainly to serve. And one of the things, and I tell this to a lot of folks who come asking, how do I join the Foreign Service? Certainly explore the Foreign Service, and it is a worthy institution and career. But there are a lot of places in government that now have international offices and arms. And in some cases, you can actually have more responsibility. You can have more freedom of movement. I mean, state is a pretty bureaucratic place, hierarchical place. And so, working, for instance, at the Small Business Administration has an international office. I learned when I was at the NSC. Working for, whether it's the Agricultural Department has a foreign service, commercial services, a foreign service. So all of those, I think, are opportunities. And then I would also say, don't do what I did, which was to kind of hop immediately from school into the Foreign Service. Get out, go work for a humanitarian organization overseas, get those experiences of living beyond the wall and the wire, and use that to then inform both, who you are, what you want to do. And I think you'll be a much better diplomat, leader with those experiences. And I wish I would have had them.
Well, Brett, thank you. That's excellent advice. Brett, president of a Global Situation Room. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I wish you well. If any of the things that you anticipate come true, we'll give you full credit for those. I guess I'll go ahead and turn this back to Molly, and back to Anne, and Anne will wrap up for us.
Thank you, Professor LaBelle, and thank you, Professor Bruen, for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. We certainly learned so much. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions, and we will see you at the next one.
Excellent, we're off.